Welcome, everybody. Today's lecture, if I had to pick one lecture between the uh, first midterm and the final, remember, the final is not cumulative, but everything after the first midterm could be on the, or the things you'll have to study and could be on the final. But if I had to pick one lecture that I would call by far the most important, it's this one, today's, for two reasons. One is I can guarantee you that at least two slides of the ones we're going to see right now will be, and obviously I got to tell you which ones, but I'll tell you which ones I'm not removing, as I always do from the study list, but at least two of them will be on the final, possibly one in the ID section and one in the slide essay part. And the other reason is architecture gets short shrift in most textbooks. Even the best art historian can't be an expert in every field: painting, sculpture, architecture, photography. But architecture is my area of expertise, and it is something that you know from when you enrolled in the class. There is a textbook required, and it's reasonably affordable. I think it was $22 on Amazon for the one I wrote about Julia Morgan. Now, some of you came on several of you came on the tour, and I don't have to explain to you, perhaps now you know better than you would otherwise, why Julia Morgan is an underappreciated, I won't say underrated, but underappreciated architect in the history of American architecture, besides being the first female. We'll talk all about that, to have her own practice in the entire history of the United States. That right there makes her an important figure. Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to mention very briefly, we need to get going because we have a lot to cover today. We've got three of the most, in fact, I think the three most important architects in American history: Bernard Maybeck, the first green designer; Julia Morgan, the first independent female and most prolific ever of all American architects; and Frank Lloyd Wright, the most famous, of course, and influential of all architects. Okay, so we are going to cover them each with, you can see how important they are if they each got two slides on the syllabus, but we still have a couple more slides to get through before we get to those three architects. I think we can do it all today in maybe 2 or 3 minutes after 4:15, 4:20 at the very latest. But I urge you to make sure you take good notes and review this lecture before the final. Okay, good timing. We haven't got started yet. And one last thing about grades, and that is, I already sent everybody an email. I should have guessed this. I never tried to get grades back in less than 2 weeks from an assignment. When I have, scores and scores of students, and I've got, dozens I grade, then some go to one or even, well, more than one other reader, and they have to come back and forth. Electronic glitches, it just wasn't possible to get all the grades back. And I do not believe in sending partial completions of grades to just a few students, because then the others who don't get their grades back for the next several days have a right to say, well, how come that person got their grade before I did? I turned my assignment in on time. So it's called equity, level playing field, whatever, equal, of course, opportunity. So I will have all the grades done for the second midterm and back in my inbox by tomorrow evening. I'm not sure how late, but let's say certainly by 8 p.m., if not sooner. I should have them for it. So certainly Friday morning, you should be able to look in your inbox, okay, and find the grades you got on your midterm plus an explanation of how you got that grade. Okay, let's let in, oh yeah. Hi, welcome. That's Tanya, right? Okay. So I'm going to do the mute all again just because three people joined us in the last 3 minutes. Let's get started right away with early modern architecture. Now, if you didn't already notice how important this topic is, it should become fairly evident from the fact that at the bottom of the list of terms to know for this week, you see there's more information than usual. I've been able to distill this kind of, concepts of definitions of movements in architecture, which most people have no background in. I understand that. A lot of people don't even realize that architecture is the queen of all arts. That's what the Greeks called it. And the reason is because it's the only art form or medium of art that is essential to any urban society or urban civilization. You have to have housing, you have to have places for people to gather. Of course, architecture is both an art form and an essential element of all urban civilizations. So that's why I think it deserves the attention we're going to give it. Okay, so let's get started with the fact that I gave you guys the shortest possible, I guess you could say it, minimal tagline is there. That's what I'll call it. For the 5 main movements of modern architecture, here's what I want you not to stress out too much. These are not separate standalone definitions. However, I'm going to give you the features of each of these movements as they come up in the slides this week and next week. We will probably not get through all the slides. Well, we might from today's list. You see how I've broken it into the earlier slides that we saw of Art Nouveau. We already covered that. And by the way, I'm going to have to cross out 2 of them. So you're getting a break here. Take your pens, everybody. Now you get 2 less slides I have to worry about under Art Nouveau. And those are, as far as we got yesterday, we didn't get Guimard, Paris Metro Station. If you've been to Paris, I know several of you have, you know how beautiful those 1900 vintage World's Fair designed subway stations are. They're works of art. Even the signs are works of art. Every movie ever set in Paris, I just watched FBI International, an episode set in Paris, and they focused on meeting people in front of whichever metro station that they chose to. They are wonderful works of art. We don't have time to cover them. So cross out Guimard, that's how you pronounce it, Paris Metro Station, not to be on the test. And the one below it, okay? Yeah, absolutely. When you go to Paris, you'll see what I mean. I mean, subway stations can be just pedestrian and utilitarian, or they can be works of art. And the French, they tend to make things more into the work of art category. Okay, the next one also, this is a beautiful place, but nobody here will probably ever get there unless you get to Glasgow. Macintosh, it's not the computer company. Cross off Macintosh, Glasgow School of Art. Okay, let me let in, yeah, okay. So what we're doing now is just about to start with the first slide after those 2, okay, which will be Paxton, the Crystal Palace, 1851. Okay, so let's take a look at that now. This is our first must know for today. So yes, you need to start taking notes as soon as the slide is fully on the screen. Okay, I'll say the title and the architect and the date slowly again. Paxton, the last name, of course, of the architect, Paxton. The title is 3 words, the Crystal Palace. Those are all words you all know how to spell. The Crystal Palace, 1851. Well, this photo alone should give you some idea of why this is such an important structure. If you know about this period, I know several of you traveled in Europe, then you probably also would be familiar with all of the glass and steel train stations in cities like Paris, London, well, not so much in Rome, Brussels, Vienna, all these major European capital cities have this style of architecture. Well, this is the first functional building. In fact, here's the meaning. You should be taking notes now. This is considered by many historians, definitely including myself, to be the first modern building, period. Pretty strong statement to make. How can you decide which is the first modern? Well, there's an easy way to determine. Why is this building, which was the entire first World's Fair, was held inside one building? No other World's Fair ever did that. They always have different buildings for each country, as some of you may know, but boy, if you've never been to a World Fair, you don't know what you're missing. You can't just go to Disneyland or Disney World and say, okay, I've seen, or Vegas, I've seen what all these foreign places look like. No, you need to go to the real places to know what it's like in a different culture and learn from those cultures. So this was the first World's Fair. It was the entire exhibit hall. It was called the Crystal Palace. It was nicknamed that, but that became the official name. And the architect wasn't even an architect. Just like Eiffel. Remember, we covered Eiffel. I told you the Eiffel Tower is a very high possibility of being on the exam. So is this one. That man, Eiffel, who designed the Eiffel Tower, was first an engineer and second an architect. So he was both. So was this guy. Paxton was an engineer who designed railroad stations and bridges all over the British Isles. And then he won a competition to design the first World's Fair building. and it was all in one building. I'm going to show you a close-up, but if it's on the exam, this is the view you'll have. This is the largest clearly, delineated shot I can show. This is what it looked like inside. All of these little sections here, you can see up along the balcony and along the ground floor, each had a different country's exhibits. So it could all be in one building. Remember what a World's Fair is. If it's not obvious, you might want to write that's part of the meaning if this slide was on the slide essay part of the final. A World's Fair is an international event hosted in different cities every few years. There's no set time. It's not like, Olympics or something. It's just whenever a city decides that they want to do it, and the International Committee of World's Fairs agrees. So just say it that, keep it simple and say every few years, various cities host all of the nations of the world in that city for a World's Fair to display their products and their culture, not just products, because that's a major part of it. What do they produce? What would that country be, able to export? You can see those things at a World's Fair, but you also can see all their cultural legacy. Everything from a Michelangelo statue of David, which was at this World's Fair in the Italian. Of course, where else would it be? It was in the Italian pavilion. But of course, at that time, there was no country of Italy. So I think it was the Vatican. Anyway, there was people from Italy at this fair, and they had an exhibit section inside the building. And one of the exhibits there was the statue of David. So it's a major world event, the first World's Fair ever held. They're still being held all over the world, except in this country for economic reasons. So World's Fairs are not a thing of the past. Many other countries in every other continent, in fact, even on this continent, Canada still had World's Fairs as recently as late in the 20th century. We won't ever have any more, but the rest of the world still has them. So anyway, that's what this was, the very first World's Fair in a building designed by an engineer who had been a railroad station and bridge designer. And he came up with this brilliant idea. And this may be the most important thing about this building as to why is it considered to be the first modern building? Because you can say it's a perfect, there we go, perfect example of the concept form follows function. You're going to hear that phrase several times in this today and next week's lecture. Because when it comes to architecture, that is almost like a mantra, right, for architects if they believe in this philosophy. I'll say it again. This building is the first, a perfect example of, and the first major structure to follow the, concept of form follows function. That's an actual quote from some artist in the 1800s who was describing something totally different, but it was adopted by architects of the mid and late 19th century. So what is that? Well, over 150 years ago, they started using it. And this is the first building to do that. And if it's not, of course, immediately obvious, what does that mean? Then let's take another look at the interior. There is no extra, here's what that means when it comes to a building like this, or certain train stations or other public buildings. Mostly it's for public buildings that's philosophy of form follows function applies as it does here. There's no extraneous ornament. This is in the middle of the Victorian era when everything was crammed full of decorations. You know this from ever having seen, most of you been inside some, I assume, right, Victorian homes or seen them in movies or, on the internet. Victorian architecture was known for its excessive ornament, not this building. There is not a single decorative detail. In other words, everything on and in, or the structure itself of this building is functional. And no extraneous, you could say, or superfluous, a better word. Superfluous means not necessary, right? There's no superfluous decorative detail. None needed. The architect decided it wasn't needed. There were people that hated this building when it first opened and criticized it for being naked and ugly and an assault on the senses because it didn't have any ornamental detail. But it was the forerunner of the whole concept of form follows function itself, and this building specifically were the beginnings of modern architecture in the Western world, at least. The ceiling, look at that, just skylights and metal posts, which are purely functional. There's no like lion's heads or, faces of the king or queen on them, nothing, no ornament, just functional. Everything's functional. It's all metal and glass. Actually, it was steel and glass. And that's what most skyscrapers are these days. And this is long before the first skyscraper. So it's a remarkable achievement. And this building started the whole concept. Now, it wasn't immediately accepted. As I said, it was criticized by some people at the time, but those who understood, the idea of form follows function and could see how the future was going to embrace it, were praising it before the fair closed. By the way, this building, one last thing before we do the formal elements, could hold over 200,000 people at one time in one building. That's a lot. And it often was that crowded because it was such a successful event. I think it was 10 million people. Remember, that was the population of all of Great Britain. And it was Great Britain at 70 million people now. It was only about 10 million back in 1850 when the fair was being planned. So that's a huge chunk of both the British population and, of course, others, Europeans, North Americans came to the fair, people from around the world. Okay, and then one last thing about it, I think this might be interesting. Let's go back to the full view again. If it's on the test, this is the slide you'll see. It survived for nearly 100 years. People liked it enough that it was saved and used as an exhibit hall for many other future events. No other World's Fairs, because after this one, the World's Fair started building multiple structures, right, for each country, as I said. But this was used for many other large public events because it could hold up to 200,000 people. And it was only destroyed by an accidental fire right before World War II. If it had made it past 1939, I think was the year that's the year the war started in Europe, right? World War II. But just before World War II, an accidental fire destroyed the building. You have to write this last thing, but obviously, if it had survived into the Nazi bombing of London, it would have been destroyed by the bombers, the Nazi bombers. But it didn't survive in that late. I think it was just a few months before the war. It was destroyed or consumed, you could say, by an accidental fire. Okay, formal analysis. Well, there's no warm or cool colors, even though this photo is only black and white. They didn't have color photos in the 1850s. You can say for sure there were no warm or cool colors. It was all neutral because you had transparent glass and black painted metal. And so those are the two textures. They're real, no simulated textures. The real smooth textures of glass and steel. That's it. It is very dynamic on the ceilings and stable on the walls. Very simple. Dynamic on the ceiling, stable on all the walls. And it was completely symmetrical. You can see that. If you do a line down the middle, identical on either side. Yet you could make the case, of course, it's unbalanced toward the bottom, obviously gets wider as it goes toward the ground. And then there is the space that I already said there 200,000 people could fit. So there's the way to describe it. It was a large open structure, nearly 1/2 of a mile long with side wings, or you could just say wings, nearly 1/3 of a mile. And you can see the hint of that in this slide. The side wings had more display areas, like over past the edges of the photo here. But we're just looking at from this angle. So I'll say it again. For space, it's real space, of course. It's one large open building with the long main hall. There we go. The main hall was nearly 1/2 a mile long and 2 side arms, or you can just say arms, nearly 1/3 of a mile that could hold 200,000 people. That's how big it was. Oh, by the way, the ceiling was about 80 feet, roughly 80 feet high. So that's a real space. Line, it's all visual line, of course. You can see that here. There's no technique for modeling. I mean, the sun just shone right through it, so there wasn't really even any shadow. So there's no modeling. There's no distorted proportion or scale, of course. The rhythm should be obvious. Each panel of glass in each section or each level of the sides of this, and then of course the 2 arms. That's one of them, and the other is off the edge of the behind that wing. So those would be, of course, identical in shape. So each section of metal and glass framing created very strong rhythms. And I already said the colors were neutral. There's no warm or cool colors. Okay, we covered the Eiffel Tower. Now, here's a slide that has, I'm going to go so far as to say, a high probability, not just possibility, of being on the final. It's more important than most people could ever imagine. Anything in St. Louis would be important. Actually, I like that city a lot. But what's important is why it is considered one of, or you could say a prototype, there we go, a prototype for the modern skyscraper. And it might not seem obvious, so I'm going to explain. Here we go. This is the next must know. Make sure you take very good notes and study it carefully. Sullivan is the architect's name. Sullivan. Sullivan, his last name. And the title is Wainwright Building. 2 words, the name of the man who paid to have it built, of course, got his name on it. Wainwright, W-A-I-N-W-R-I-G-H-T. Wainwright Building, 1891. Okay, so why is this so important? It's just an old 10-story building that by today's standards, some people wouldn't even think of it as a skyscraper. They'd be wrong. So here's a definition. You see, if you look at your list of the 5 main movements of early modern architecture, we're still on meaning now. There's going to be a few sentences, more than a few sentences on the meaning. So I'll say them slowly, make sure you get those in your notes. First of all, this is one of the first examples of the Chicago School of Design, which means early skyscrapers. It's another way of saying that. I'll say that again. This building is one of the first examples of the Chicago School of Architecture. It's not a school like, the JC, obviously. It's a movement, right? As you see, it's one of the 5 main movements. A short way of defining that is early skyscrapers. But it is important to mention Louis Sullivan was the greatest practitioner of the Chicago School. In fact, he's considered one of the founders of that movement. In other words, he didn't invent the skyscraper. Don't want to say that. That wouldn't be correct. Someone before him, an engineer, came up with the idea of what a skyscraper is, and still to this day it functions, how it functions. But we'll define skyscraper in just a minute. But I want to make sure you have it in your notes that Sullivan, the architect of this building, is considered one of the founders of the Chicago School of Design or early skyscrapers. And therefore, he definitely is more influential because he became nationally famous because of that. He was so popular that he filled auditoriums full of thousands of people who paid to hear him talk. How many times could an architect do that? Well, Frank Lloyd Wright could do that while he was alive, but he died a long time ago. So what we have is Sullivan as a popular household figure. If there was mass media then, well, there was, but it was, of course, print media mostly. Magazines and newspapers would come to interview him. He was that famous, that influential, because he perfected, there's the best way to put it, he perfected the modern skyscraper. You can't say invented it. Again, there was a guy a couple of years before him that came up with this concept. So now we need to give you the only actual standalone definitions. Very important definition. Very high probability of being on the true false section of the final. And that is the 3 main features of skyscrapers. Here we go. I'll say them slowly and repeat them. First, a building of 10 or more stories. That fits. Look carefully. This is 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You go all the way up to the top, you got 10 floors. That is the minimum height for a skyscraper. This is not my definition. That's the American Institute of Architects. They're the experts. They're the ones that you have to be a member of to become a practicing architect in America, right? I'll say it again, just like you have to be a member of the Bar Association, right, to be a lawyer. So again, this is the official definition of skyscrapers, not mine. 3 main features. The first one, a building of 10 or more stories, number 1, okay? Number 2, an electric elevator. They haven't improved on it in 140 years. It was invented in the 1880s. The first electric elevator appeared in Chicago in the first skyscraper, which wasn't by Sullivan. You don't need to know who it was. It's too much information. If you care to know, it was Le Baron-Jenny, who was a French, mixed French and American heritage, I think trained in France, and he was an engineer. So he invented the skyscraper. Give that credit to anybody. But all you have to remember for the three features is, again, number two, an electric elevator. They still have the same system in every skyscraper in the world. But the third feature is maybe the most unique to skyscrapers, an internal metal skeleton. I'll say it again. Number three feature is an internal metal skeleton. Now, why is that important? Because you could not build a building of 10 or more stories that wouldn't collapse in a heap of rubble if you didn't have an internal metal skeleton or framework. You could use the word framework if you want, but most architects say skeleton because it is what you see. You've all seen skyscrapers under construction. Everybody has, right? Wherever you live, you've driven through someplace, San Francisco, Oakland, even maybe, I don't know, there aren't any new skyscrapers in Santa Rosa, right? But any big city in America, you're going to see buildings under construction. And if they're 10 or more stories and they've got a metal frame, that's a skyscraper being put together. And when it's finished, it'll have 10 or more stories and an electric elevator, just like the first skyscrapers. So that definition hasn't changed. So this is one of, in fact, it is the oldest true skyscraper, you could say early or Chicago school, which means early skyscraper or early skyscraper. It's the oldest one outside of Chicago. The skyscrapers was birthplace in Chicago. Now you're going to think I'm cynic because I'm from there and I'm being paid by the Chicago Tourism Board. No, look it up. New Yorkers didn't have any skyscrapers before the Chicago architects invented them. And then Chicago architects were imported to New York to show some local architects how to build their first skyscrapers several years after the first few. So just keep it simple. Say the birthplace of the skyscraper is Chicago because of all these architects that were there at that time in the 1880s. Why did they come? You don't have to write this. Because of the Chicago fire that destroyed the entire downtown. It all had to be rebuilt. Great opportunity for a young architect to move to a city that needed their talent. So that's how Chicago got all the best architects in the United States, or at least all the most innovative ones, including Louis Sullivan. They either were born there and stayed there and got lots of new clients because of that big fire that burned the whole downtown of Chicago completely to the ground in the 1870s.
Mrs. O'Leary's cow.
Yeah. You know, it turns out that was true. I was taught first that was true, and then we were told, oh, that's a myth. But it turns out it did happen. But it wasn't her fault. She wasn't in the barn at the time. She was blamed for it and threatened, in fact, after the fire commission investigated. Yeah, because she was a poor Irish immigrant. Of course, they had to blame somebody. Anyway, so what we have here is a building that fits the definition of an early Chicago school or early skyscraper. And form follows function is what we see here, because there are some ornaments, and that's due to Sullivan's other dictum. The good word for this is a dictum or maxim, you know, it's something you live by or work by, right? A philosophy, a summary, a single statement, I mean, of summarizing your philosophy if you're a professional. So the dictum or maxim of Sullivan, he had two. One was form follows function. He used to be credited with coining that phrase, and I just said no, it wasn't. It was some sculptor in the 1800s in France or something, but it was adopted by architects. So he believed in that philosophy. This building fits that. I mean, it is functional, and it serves. It's still a functioning business building with offices. That's what else is a skyscraper, but a commercial building, multi-story, 10 or more stories with different size building rooms. I mean, inside for offices, for businesses. Okay, but he did have a second dictum, and it's the last thing about the meaning on this one, which is he did believe that even if a building fits the form follows function, all of his did, there should be a little bit of ornament. And he had a phrase in which he applied minimal ornament, and he called it something to delight the eye of the beholder. Again, his philosophy was not just pure functionalism to the point where there's no decoration at all, but minimal ornament or minimal decorations. And he considered those are, quote, in his philosophy, important for all really well-designed buildings, because there should, and this is his phrase, he coined this phrase, always be, quote, something to delight the eye of the beholder. I personally subscribe to that, and so did Bernard Maybeck and Julia Morgan, and even Frank Lloyd Wright in some of his more simpler work, would occasionally put a little bit of a decorative feature, and we'll see that when we get to the slides later today of Wright's work. Okay, so this fits for both those maxims or dictums, you could say, phrases, which is that it is a functional building. So form follows function. Whoa, it keeps doing that when I didn't even touch the arrow. There we go. And it is already, as I defined it, so I have to repeat that, why it qualifies as one of the first skyscrapers. And it is the oldest remaining one outside of Chicago. The first skyscraper you want to know was in 1884 in Chicago. It's gone, it's been torn down. But there are buildings. If you ever go to Chicago and you have any interest in this, you can find all kinds of guidebooks and videos and apps and things that'll give you self-guided tours. There's about 24 of the oldest skyscrapers in the world, long before New York had any, from the 1880s and early 1890s, many of which were designed by Sullivan in Chicago, downtown Chicago. Okay, let's do the formal elements. It's a warm color. He liked warm colored materials. Most modern ones are like this, sterile glass and steel boxes. Frankly, I hate that, what's happened to skyscrapers. But when he was around, he wanted a warm, color for the materials on the exterior, right? And the rhythm is obvious. The windows create rhythm, right? And then these are called piers. That's the right word. We're not talking about the kind at the edge of the water. We're talking about on a building. These are functional. There is a metal beam inside this, and they're just encased with brick. And that, of course, is the actual texture of the building, is all real textures, real rough brick and stone. So this is stone, this is brick. And the framework, of course, is metal. So it's real smooth metal, real smooth glass, and real rough brick and stone. That's it. Those are the textures. All the textures. Some, and none of them are simulated. They're all real. The rhythm is obvious, as I said here. These piers between each row of windows on both sides, the side and the front. And then for space, it's about 140 feet tall. Each floor would be therefore 10 floors, right? It wouldn't take much. Each floor has about a 14-foot high. Well, actually, there's space in between for the floor. So just say nearly 14-foot high ceilings. And the rooms are varying sizes of rooms on each floor. Obviously, different offices in each of the 10 floors. The rhythm already mentioned. Let's see, balance. That's completely symmetrical. He never designed a building that wasn't symmetrical. A lot of modern architecture doesn't, but at this point, the Chicago School always had a balance, but left to right and top to bottom, whichever angle you look at it, from the side or the front. The largest mass, it's actually there. It's one mass, yes, but you could break it down into the shaft, the middle section. If you remember the first or second week of class, I drew a picture of King Kong, badly drawn, climbing up to the spire of the Empire State Building. And I described how you can divide a skyscraper into different masses. So there are 3 masses here, if you break it up this way, which would be, and Sullivan did that when he went and lectured to huge audiences describing this concept. So, well, you have the biggest section is the shaft, middle portion. Then the base is almost always the second largest, 2 stories. And then there's the upper floor. He called it the capital, like the top of a column, a Greek or Roman temple would have. So the top floor here, sometimes it's 2 floors, that has decoration, would be the 3rd largest mass. Okay, and then the lines are all visual here. Well, yeah, there are carved lines, actually. Yeah, you can almost see them here. Carved lines. They're quite beautiful, the decorations. He designed all those by himself, by hand. There were no computer assisted design firms in the 1890s, of course. So he did all these drawings of the details. I mean, the things that delight the eye of a beholder. It was all his creation. He was a very talented artist as well as an architect. Okay, and then we have modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And it is entirely stable except for the porthole windows on the upper floor here. This is all the maintenance stuff, that keeps the building running. But it's the 10th floor, and it's part of this 10 floors that like this is going to switch. Okay, there's no altered proportion or distortions here. Okay. Now, I know the answer to this, I think, because I read all of your mini files, but has anybody here been to Chicago and seen any Frank Lloyd Wright houses where Frank Lloyd Wright, he wasn't born there, but he made it his home? And his studio there is a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World. How many architects' birthplace, not birthplace, sorry, office and home residence from any period, even Michelangelo, they know where he was born and raised, has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's that important because Frank Lloyd Wright became the most influential architect in the world. Nobody argues that. The man had an ego to go with that, but there's no arguing it. So here we go. The next must know. I'm going to tell you right now, this is very high on the list of probable slides, I mean, so or buildings to be included in the final. So definitely take good notes. It won't be cut from the state list. Again, the architect's name is Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. I think everybody knows how to spell his name, his last name, Wright. And this is the Robie House, R-O-B-I-E house, 1909. Now, I'm going to sort of sound redundant, but now if you didn't write what I said before, you definitely want to start writing these facts about this slide. This is one of only 2 private residences, single family. You got to say it that way. I'll say it again. This is one of only 2 single family residences that are on the UNESCO World Heritage List. They don't usually do houses, right? Because houses are, not that large or important. Oh yeah, this one is. This is considered the prototype of the modern house, period. Nobody in architecture or architectural history would argue with that. This house in Chicago is considered, I'll say it again, the prototype for the modern house. We'll say why. There's so many things this house did that no other architect had thought of for any house. That's why it's on the UNESCO World Heritage List. You might guess what the other one is. It's also by Frank Lloyd Wright, and we're going to see it next, and that is Falling Water, which is even more famous. That one has been in movies and books and plays. But this one is pretty important. About 1 million people a year, just to give you an indication how important this house is to anyone who studies architecture, whether just for their own interest or to become an architect or urban planner or anything like that. Over 1 million people a year from all over the world come to take guided tours of this house. It's a museum now, in other words, open to the public. Okay, so this is in Chicago. It's my old neighborhood. In fact, it's where Obama's presidential library is being built, just a couple blocks from here, by the way. This is where I grew up. So what is this? What you should say about it? Well, this house, the design, here we go, of this house introduced several new concepts. We'll start with the first one that I'll bet all of you are familiar with, because every millennial I've ever seen interviewed about what kind of house they want says, I want open concept. Okay, fine. Then they owe this architect and this building a debt of gratitude. So I'll say it again, how he put it, right? Said this, the first thing that broke through, created a new concept in this house design was a free flowing floor plan. There's your alliteration. Wright did that sometimes so people could remember his concepts. He was even more famous than Sullivan, of course. And after Sullivan died, Wright continued to be very influential. He was a rock star of architecture, really. So I'll say it again. He had a concept of the open, the open concept that people say now. And he called it, for the first time, it was used in this house as a private resident. He called it a free flowing floor plan. If you were to open one door at either end on the main floor, we're talking about the common rooms, the living room, the dining room, the library, and a sitting room. I think it's 4 rooms, all open into each other. So if you open the doors, you don't have any solid walls. In other words, dividing each room, like the Victorian houses always divided every interior into a bunch of smaller rooms. And most houses before that did. So I'll say it again, he created the concept with this house for the first time of a free flowing floor plan, or you could say an open floor plan on the main floor. Now, the bedrooms and bathrooms still had solid walls. Okay, the second thing he did was minimal ornament. Now, there is some ornament here, though, but you have to be inside the house to really notice it, except for these. These are flower urns, right? Urns and they actually had, not anymore, they don't take care of them, but when the house was being used as a residence, there were, large flowering plants in those. So that's decorative. So that's one of his philosophies, is that you have minimal ornament and then you subordinate that ornament to the overall function of the house, or to the sweeping shape of it. Look at it. It's a long horizontal shape. So now we get to the second of the list of 5 main movements. That's what this is, a prototype for the second in our list of 5 main movements of early modern architecture is Prairie School, which is early modern houses. Again, you see it there. I put it in parentheses, so it's keep it brief so that, you know, if it's on the exam, you'd want to know what prairie meant if this is on the essay part, because this is the first fully or completely prairie style house or prairie school house with the features I'm telling you. So let's summarize what those features are in just three items. What makes this an early modern house and a prototype for the Prairie School, which then became internationally famous. There's places in Moscow, Russia, I've been to them, which imitate this style within a few years. It was an international sensation. I can't exaggerate. It was in the magazine covers in multiple languages. He was invited to speak in foreign countries. Yeah, it caught the world's imagination by storm, this house. Immediately, it became very influential, and the whole a modern concept of ranch houses, which some people think is mid-century, but they're still being used, starts with this, the whole idea of the open floor plan or free-flowing floor plan. So here are the 3 features of the Prairie School. I've already mentioned one of them, and I'll repeat it. Minimal ornament. You see here, all you can see in this slide is two flower boxes. Minimal ornament, it also has stained glass windows. So just keep it simple. Minimal ornament subordinated to the horizontal lines. The whole house is in, of course, Chicago. There ain't no hills in Chicago. You'll never see a poster for Ski Chicago. It's flat, the whole city, okay? So, of course, that's the prairie. Obviously, the prairie is flat. So that's why he coined this. He gave this name to his own style, this prototype, calling it the Prairie School, because it was built for a flat environment. Now, of course, you can have prairie style houses anywhere in the world, but the lots they're on are going to be level. They just have to be, because the houses themselves, I'll say it again, the second feature is horizontal lines and massing of all prairie schools houses and modern houses really is horizontal lines and massing. The whole house has a horizontal feel to it. It's lots wider than it is tall, if you want to look at it that way. So again, sweeping horizontal lines and massing is the second feature. I'll repeat the first one just to make sure you got it. And it doesn't matter what order you put these in. The other feature I already mentioned again is minimal ornament, or ornaments, plural, because usually more minimal ornaments subordinated to the horizontal lines. You see how this looks? Just like the lines of the house itself. You see that, right? The flower. And then the windows also are very horizontal. They're not tall, narrow, vertical. They're arranged in a group or band of windows. And he invented that idea. You could say a wall of windows or a wall of glass. If you want, that's one of his inventions. So again, the second feature I already said is the horizontal lines and massing throughout the building, in this case, throughout the house. And the third feature might be the one that surprises most people. And every modern house, no matter, unless, you know, it's hand built by someone who doesn't have any knowledge of how to keep their house heated and cool in the summer. It's called a central. The third feature of the Prairie School houses he invented is a central utility core. Those 3 words, I'll say it again slowly. A central utility core. What does that mean? You're looking at it from the outside. That means all the systems that keep the house, you know, the wiring, the plumbing, the heating, the air conditioning are all contained in shafts, you could say, or conduits, whichever way you want to say, shafts or conduits, which are housed in a concrete central utility core. Now, why does that matter? You ever been to a Midwestern winter? You wouldn't have to ask. If something breaks in the middle of a very, very cold winter, or even in a very hot, humid day in the hottest part of the summer, you're not going to want to go outside to fix it. You don't have to if it's designed like this, as almost all modern houses are, including the cheapest tract houses in suburbia are designed this idea, with this idea that you contain everything in a central shaft where you can get to it from the inside of the house. on whichever level it is you need to fix, the plumbing, the wiring, the heating, and air conditioning, whatever else the house needs. In other words, all the systems for maintaining the house are contained in one section called the central utility core. It's a revolutionary idea. Nobody had thought of those. All three of those together are what make this a prototype of the modern house, or the first fully prairie schoolhouse. Now, there's one last thing. Look at this roof line. Some of you may have noticed when you've been looking at this slide, it's a little unusual. Oh, absolutely. That's 15 feet of unsupported concrete slab. It should have cracked and collapsed and killed somebody by now, while they're sipping their Chardonnay or whatever on their own deck. Why didn't it? Because he came up with another new idea, which is not true of all modern houses, but it's his contribution to his prairie houses, or his invention for his prairie houses, and that is pre-stressed cantilevered roof lines. Oh, sorry, pre-stressed concrete cantilevered roof lines. This is concrete, and it's got cables buried inside the concrete, which allow it to jut out 15 feet from the wall with no columns, no brackets, no wires, nothing else supporting it, because it's supported from the inside. Again, it's this radical, revolutionary stuff. And if it doesn't seem obvious to you that this is far ahead of its time because you're so used to seeing these kind of features now in modern residences, look at the house next door. I had a friend that lived in, we see where this cursor is? I had a friend that lived there the whole time I was in grade school. I used to go visit him and look down at this house. This house is from the same period next door, and look how different it is. I actually like it. It's a colonial revival with stained glass windows, and a lot of almost late Victorian, early 20th century details. Same year, 1909, as this house right next door. Look how different they are. It's like an entire universe of differences between them, not just a world. So Wright became immediately internationally famous, became a sensation. And it went to his head, and I won't go into that. But if you know anything about his life, it intrigued people in his life, especially the 4 wives he had, very well, among other things. But that's not really part of what made, obviously, his legacy in architecture is undeniable, his influence. He's the father of the modern house. There's no other way to put that. And you could say Sullivan is the perfecter of the modern skyscraper. The two of them worked together. Oh, I forgot one last fact. Sullivan hired Wright when Wright was 18 years old and just starting, never took a class. Right. Sullivan did, but Wright never took any classes. You have to write this part, in architecture anywhere. Well, he started to take one at the University of Wisconsin and dropped out halfway through the semester. The world's most famous architect. It's kind of ironic. And so he went to Chicago, and maybe he was 19 by the time he actually was hired by Sullivan. Sullivan taught him everything he knew. He said it himself, right? Admitted this years later when Sullivan died. They were partners, not quite. No, he was like a, top designer in Sullivan's firm, which was booming with business from all over the United States. There's a Sullivan's skyscraper in downtown San Francisco too, by the way, from that same period. So the point is that Wright worked for Sullivan, learned everything Sullivan had to teach him, and then stole almost all of his best clients. It's called moonlighting, or intellectual theft. Now it's a legal term, you can be sued for it, but not back then. So he took almost all of Sullivan's best clients by, surreptitious means, just say underhanded methods, got them to move away from Sullivan's practice and sign up to work with, to have him do their buildings. Sullivan never forgave him for that. It's like a Greek tragedy, right? The master teaching the young student, and then the young student betrays the master. So that's a pretty well established fact, but you don't have to add that. Oh, that's part of the meaning. Okay, let's do a formal analysis and keep moving. This is completely symmetrical left to right. And of course, you can see wider at the bottom, unbalanced toward the bottom. The rhythm is obvious with all these windows. They're called banded. You don't have to know that term, but you'll see them on buildings. Actually, we did on our walking tour, at least in the last building, those who came on the tour on Sunday. Rows of windows side by side like that. Wright didn't invent that. There's a debate whether Maybach here in the Bay Area deserves credit for that or Wright. It's a pointless argument. They both were doing it very early on. So that creates rhythm. One exactly the same shape, one after the other. And of course, there's also little details like the flower. urns and so forth. So it's full of rhythm and it is almost entirely stable. Look at all the lines of the roof lines projecting outward, the banded windows, the concrete trim at the top of the brick walls, the roof lines, it all is repeated shapes and they're all almost totally stable. But people think of it as dynamic. It has that effect on you when you stand even close to it, but especially like this photo was taken across the street. And it has a sweeping feeling that makes it feel dynamic, but technically it's entirely stable. And of course, the textures, well, it's not obvious. They're all real smooth glass, real rough brick, and real rough wood on the window frames, and real rough concrete. So 4 textures: real rough brick, concrete, and wood, and real smooth glass. Okay, and then for space, it's about a 4,500 square foot house. You can say it's a 3-story home. I don't remember how many bedrooms, but a multi-room house, single family residence. It was only meant for one family, and it has about a 4,500 square feet interior space. And I don't know if you could say the largest mass. Yeah, I guess you would have to say it's the main floor, and then the upper floor. But there is a basement area too, but it doesn't go all the way out here. That the deck would be perhaps the 4th largest mass. So it's the main floor, which looks like the 2nd floor on this one, but they would call it the main floor. And then the ground floor, which is like servants' quarters, you know, storage rooms. And then the 3rd largest mass is the upper floor. That's where all the bedrooms are. Okay, and lines are visual lines. There's no carved or drawn line. There's no altered proportion or distortion.
Did you say servant quarters?
Yeah, yeah. This guy was a rich banker who hired Wright, and Wright did.
Oh,
Yeah. Of course, servants' quarters are almost always included
Mhm.
inside the houses at that time. Sometimes they were separate structures, but usually they were inside. These would be like poor Irish immigrant women working for. Actually, we know exactly. This family got divorced. The husband divorced his wife after an affair within a year after he moved into the house. That happened to a lot of don't write this. A lot of Wright's clients would divorce within a year or two. There was almost, some people had a nickname, the Frank Lloyd Wright curse, because he also went through 3. Well, one of his wives actually was killed in a horrible tragedy, but the other 2 of the other 3 he divorced because he was involved with somebody else. Yeah, so
Were they sleeping with the help?
very scandalous personal life, but that's not what's important for the slides. Okay, let's move on, and we will see. Let's see. Why don't we do this? If I have, and I think I do. Yeah, let's do falling.
Oh, the waterfall.
Yeah, Falling Water. Yeah, it's
Falling
called
Water.
Falling Water. Yeah, by Wright. I already spelled his name right. 2 words, just like it sounds. Falling Water, 1936. This is the only other single family residence on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. What does that tell you about how influential Wright was? He's the only architect that has that distinction in the history of the human race. That doesn't mean that Michelangelo's buildings aren't equally important, and many more of them are on the UNESCO World Heritage List, but there are no single family residences on that list. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a private residence, of course, single family, built over a waterfall. What are you, nuts? No, don't write that. That's what people thought when they heard about it. The architect and the client agreed. This man, by the way, he is now, his great-grandson has donated the house to, I believe it's the state of Pennsylvania, so it's open as a museum. It's no longer. Okay, and so what we have here, hang on, I'm just going to do this because we got a little bit of background noise. There we go. Okay. All right. Anyway, let's talk about what makes this so unique. This is not Prairie School. I know people looking at this might think, oh, well, you got your horizontal massing and overhanging roof lines, you know, and I guess it's done with cantilever pre-stressed concrete slabs. So the construction methods are the same, but it's different because it's interchangeable. The parts, the modern materials, the metal, the glass, and the concrete are interchangeable. And then the local materials, and this is local stone from Western Virginia, Virginia, I'm all right, Western Pennsylvania. That's an important detail. This is in the mountains of, yeah, you're gonna laugh. The mountains of Pennsylvania don't even get to 4,000 feet. In California, we might think that's not a mountain, but back east, they call those mountains. So you say it's in the mountains of Western Pennsylvania, way out in the countryside. And it was meant to be there because the owner wanted it as his summer retreat. He was a millionaire owner of a department store chain. It's still around in downtown Pittsburgh, actually, the nearest big city. He was from Pittsburgh. So this is, just say it's in the rural part of Western Pennsylvania. And it was chosen, this site, carefully because the owner, you don't have to know his name, but if you want to know, it's Kaufman. They're still around and they could keep the house, but they've donated it to the public because they want people to be able to come and enjoy it. Actually, it's been unopened to the public for years, but now it's officially a state landmark. If not national, I'm sure it's a national landmark. Kaufman, if you want to write his name, was Kaufman. And so the point is, his request to write was, can you build a house around or near the waterfall? He didn't come up with the idea of putting the house right on top of the waterfall. That was Wright's idea. Wright came up with that idea. And of course, it's genius. I mean, that phrase is used so much, I'm sick of hearing it on the internet. It's genius, this cough medicine. Come on, cough medicine being genius? Give me a break. Get rid of your advertising hyperbole. But this was genius. When Wright said to Kaufman, you can say his client, if you want to keep it simple, you want the waterfall to be a part of this site and the house itself. How about we put it right over the waterfall so that when you're on your decks, in the warm months, at least, it gets pretty cold there in the winter, you can see and hear the waterfall right below you. Brilliant. And this house became extremely popular. In fact, there was a model of it at Disneyland. When I first went to Disneyland as a kid in the 60s, this was in Tomorrowland, a model of this. They didn't quite call it Frank Lloyd Wright, or they would have had to pay Wright for the permission, but it was an obvious knockoff of this concept. It's world famous. And as I said, it's one of the only two single family homes that are on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So if it's not Prairie, what is it? You can say it's a variation or offshoot of the Prairie School that he created, and he called it Usonian. It's one word. He coined that word. No one else had ever thought of it. Usonian. The last 25 years of his life, he practiced this concept. It's Usonian. What did he mean by that? He meant form follows function. That's still the concept underlying, everything we've been seeing today, right? Including this house. But now there's two differences between this and the Prairie School, which is that this is made of interchangeable parts that are brought to the site and assembled. The reason, why did he do that? Just to be different? No, he did it to make these homes more affordable. Now, for this guy, no, he had no budget to worry about. This guy was a millionaire, but he wanted middle-class families to be able to afford to build their own houses. And he even sold kits, if you can believe that. It's build it yourself kits. There's a house in Marin County in San Anselmo that is a Frank Lloyd Wright kit house. It's designed by Wright, but he didn't show up to help finish it or supervise it. He gave the permission, sold, of course, the rights to build a design he had already created to several other middle-class families. They're all over the West Coast. In my book on Frank Lloyd Wright, that's in the libraries here, the main campus and public libraries, called Frank Lloyd Wright on the West Coast. You don't have to look at that book, of course, to get an A in this class, but I put a whole chapter on this movement. He called it the Usonian movement, by which he was trying to come up with a word, to symbolize the idea of affordable housing for the average family, because the pieces of it were interchangeable and could be mass produced. That's the difference between this and a Prairie School house, which were all very individually designed and custom made, and therefore, of course, more expensive.
Can you still get the kits?
That's a good question. I think you can. There's still the Frank Lloyd Wright Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona, is still functioning as a school of design. I've had students I've written letters of recommendation for who've been admitted there. I'm very proud to say that it's still a school of design that some former students of mine have gotten their degree in architecture and gone off to practice. I think that's still open. And if it is, you could look that up and easily, of course, see. I don't know for sure. As recently as several years ago, you still could. Yeah, Wright died in 59, but his last wife, who was 35 years younger than he was, and of Russian heritage, She outlived him by about 35, 40 years. She lived into her 90s. Well, he did too. So do the math, obviously. They were- they-
I
they-
wonder if she was tall and leggy.
yeah, yeah. Well, her name was Olga Vanna,
Hmm.
and she ran the institute. And she would. I know of houses where after he died, decades after he died, they were still selling the rights to his.
Hmm.
So as recently as the turn of this century, they were doing that, the early
Hmm.
20s, or early 21st century. So maybe still. Okay, let's wrap it up with a formal analysis. It's balanced. You'd have to stand here and look at it. I think I have another view. Yeah, actually, I like this view better. I'm thinking I might use, if it's, I'm not saying it will be on the exam. I may or may not cut it from the study list. Let's just say it's important enough you don't want to get rid of your notes. Okay, if you stood here, you'd see it's symmetrical. But of course, it's weighted toward the bottom, as all Wright's multi-story residences are, because the floors on the lower level are always wider. So it's unbalanced toward the bottom. The largest mass, though, is none of those three floors. You see there's down here again, servants' quarters, a garage, laundry room, and all that, and then the main common rooms, living room, et cetera, and then the bedrooms. But the largest mass is the central utility core. In this case, it's not concrete, it's lined by stone. Okay, and then the colors are warm yellow paint. And a couple of you have told me you've been to the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Same color, same material on the exterior, that building is yellow tinted concrete. It makes it a warm color. And he used painted red metal framing for the windows. So of course the materials are all real. Textures, the textures are all real smooth glass and metal in the windows, real smooth. In this case, the concrete is smooth. Some concrete is rough, but this is smooth. And then real rough stone on the utility core, which again is the largest mass. The second largest would be the main floor, and then the upper floor would be the third largest. For space, it's a 3-story house of over 4,000 square feet. I think it's right around 4,000, so say about 4,000 square feet, with multiple bedrooms. And an open floor plan on the main level, which is that much is the same, of course, along with the utility core from when he did the prairie stuff. Okay, and then we have lines are just visual. The modeling, of course, would be, well, actually, there are lines on the window framing. That's right, and that includes on the utility shaft there. I guess it's a staircase, a stairwell. Okay, and so then when you have here, I've never been to this house, but anybody here been here? I've almost never had a student who's been here. But believe it or not, this is getting not a million people like the one in Chicago a year, but several 100,000 people a year from all over the world come to see this house. Okay, and let's see, are we forgetting anything? Balance, rhythm is obvious with repeated cantilevered roof lines and the window framing, the shape, the overall shapes of it. And there's no distorted mass, right? Okay, I think I covered everything. All right, let's go back to Bernard Maybeck, the father of green design is how I call him. So here we go. This is the next must know. This one's important enough. I'm not cutting it from the study list. Maybeck, First Church of Christ scientist, 1910. Again, Maybeck, last name I spelled Maybeck. First, the title is First Church of Christ scientist. Some people just say Christian Science or Christian Scientist, but they prefer this title, and that's what every book that has this building. It's on the cover of my book about Maybeck, and I've been in a lot of books. It's a National Historic Landmark. Some future walking tour, if any of you take any of my class in the future, or you are invited by one of my then future students as a guest, we'll go inside this building. It's mind-boggling. It's so beautiful inside. People ooh and awe when they walk inside this. It's hard to explain. You have to be there to see it. It's incredible. And it's a functioning church of this day. So again, the correct title is First Church of Christ Scientist, 1910. Okay, this is an example of, and then take a look at our lists of the 5 main movements. First Bay tradition. You see it's second from the bottom, that movement. And again, you don't need to consider, there's not going to be a separate standalone definition, but I do need to describe what that means for the meaning notes on this slide, obviously. It's a classic example or perfect example of First Bay tradition or nature-based design. Another way of saying that is Maybeck, if you didn't write it before, now you definitely want to write this. is considered the father of green design by most historians, and he deserves that title. He founded the School of Architecture, is one of the reasons, at UC Berkeley, which teaches green design, but it didn't exist until he started that program. There were no architecture classes at UC Berkeley in the 1890s. When he moved to Berkeley, you'll have to know where he moved from. It was in New York City, actually. Just say that he had his degree in architecture from the school in Paris. You don't have to say which one, but just say from a French architecture school. And then he moved to Berkeley, and he started this new philosophy, as well as founding the School of Design. It's called Environmental Design School at Berkeley, meaning the architecture program. It was his, he was the head of it. He founded, he started it, he taught all these classes. And guess who one of his first students was? Julia Morgan. And the two of them together would definitely be considered the leading practitioners. I'll say it slowly. Julia Morgan and Bernard Maybeck, both architects in the Bay Area, were practicing before the turn of the last century, meaning the late 1800s, early 1900s, as the leading practitioners of First Bay tradition movement, or in other words, the first fully nature-based design architects. Green design is a short way of saying that. Everybody says, oh, it's so modern, it's so new. It's going, already was around in the 1890s, because Maybeck came up with this idea that buildings should use only natural materials from the local environment. These are the things that mark something in First Bay tradition. The buildings are made out of natural materials from the local environment. And they are all handcrafted, not mass produced. So that's different than Wright with the Usoni, right? Because each building was uniquely created for each client. There was no prototype like Wright had with Prairie School and Usonian. So again, I'll say that the second thing is that each building is a unique design, and they were handcrafted, you could say it that way, for each client differently. You know, each one was a unique work of art. And then another feature of First Bay tradition is a mixture of historic motifs with modern materials and construction methods. That may seem incongruous, like, well, what do you mean? Well, look here, that's a Gothic window. Look carefully, that's Gothic architectural, medieval European, right, Gothic style architecture detail on the windows, only on those windows. But these are factory sash windows because they were saving money. And also he had beautiful, if you ever go inside, you'll see why I say beautiful tinted yellow glass. But those are modern materials and modern techniques, these windows here. So you've got modern materials and construction methods on some of the windows, and then traditional, historic motif, in this case, Gothic, medieval Gothic style. Look at this porch, the roof of the porch itself. That's a Japanese pagoda style roof line, right? And we've covered that, remember, in this class. So that's an influence of Japanese architecture. And then you have Spanish colonial influence in the red clay tile. The whole roofs are covered with that. And then you go back to the modern materials of asbestos siding. You can't see it in this slide because the bushes and the trellising and the vines overgrow it. But the main walls are made out of asbestos. Why would he do that? Because the previous church on this site that this group owned burned in an accidental fire. They wanted a fireproof building. No building is totally fireproof, but they got as close as you could get with this design. So it has asbestos paneling for the walls, which is obviously a very modern material. Okay, and then the last thing that makes it a Bay tradition, and I think it's the most important, the last fact about the meaning of this, you could say, is that it integrates with its site and the environment. All Bay tradition buildings do that, whether they're a small 2-bedroom bungalow or they're a large building like this that can hold hundreds and hundreds of people. It has a 600 or 700 seat auditorium, plus all kinds of other rooms, offices, a reading room, classrooms. It's not just the church itself. The church is the central focus, but it's a complex all under one roof. So again, I'll say that the last thing that makes a building, and this one, of course, specifically, First Bay tradition design, is that the building integrates with its site. Well, look at these giant 100-plus-year-old redwood trees. They were there when he designed the building. They were much smaller, and he said, don't cut them down, keep them there and leave them as objects that will then grow with the building. as the trellising does, you see there, and the walls with the vines. I mean, it's all part of his concept that the building becomes integrated with its site and the general environment. That is very different than any other philosophy before. So that's why he's considered the first green design. Okay, let's do the formal elements. Is it balanced? Yes, completely symmetrical, left to right and top to bottom. I would say because the porch looks, taller, but look carefully behind it, the way the roof lines, I think it's roughly balanced both ways, top to bottom and left to right. This is definitely symmetrical in terms of the placement of the windows, the columns. So the rhythm is obvious with those columns. With the factory sash, you could just say metal framed windows, and the Gothic trim or tracery, it's called, the Gothic decorations on the bigger window in the background, and the beams on the Japanese style, porch. Lots of rhythm. It is dynamic and stable. The overall shape of the building from left to right is fairly horizontal, but there's an upward thrust, obviously, of the roof lines and the porch and the columns. So it's both stable and dynamic. And then it is, I already said, but I'll repeat that. It has several, just say a dozen or more rooms, one of which, the largest of which, is the auditorium that can hold up to 600 people. It's over 600 people, yeah. And that's one big open space. And the other rooms are various sizes of meetings and meeting rooms and offices for the church officials. And the textures are the real, there's no simulated textures, the real smooth texture of glass and metal on some of the windows. And then a real rough texture of wood on the beaming, a real smooth texture of tile, clay tile on the roof, and real rough texture of concrete on the columns. And then the doors are real rough wood. So it's all real, no simulated textures. That's a basic idea, but the whole idea of nature-based design is you don't make things false. You don't make them try to look like something they're not, like Victorians would do. Okay, and then let's see, there's no altered proportion here. And let's see, the largest mass would be the entryway. If you count this as a single mass, you could just say porch, because it basically is a porch. And then the two side wings, that's all you can see here, are about equal. And I guess you could say that the entrance itself, the two main doors, are the third largest mass.
Is it all one level?
Yeah, it is. It's all one level, yeah. It's open to the public free of charge every Sunday, even if it's Christmas Day, every Sunday of the year, for a guided tour, but you have to have at least 6 people. And I usually organize those tours, and then we get.
In Oakland or Berkeley?
Berkeley. It's Berkeley on Dwight Way, just below.
Oh, I've seen it before.
Yeah,
yes.
it's very famous. Yeah. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright was jealous of this. Bill, you don't write this. He actually said, well, you could see by looking at that church where Mr. Mabeck got his ideas. No, he didn't. Mabeck was designing buildings before Wright opened his office, not much before, a couple of years before. So it's silly for Wright's ego was hurt when people compared them. Who became more famous? Wright, because he was an egomaniac and he promoted himself. He was such a good self-promoter. And we've seen some of that. I won't get political here. Anyway, so this is a World Heritage Site in the making. It's on that list, but it hasn't been declared officially. It probably will be by the end of this decade. Okay, because there's only a few buildings that you're added. Okay, I'm going to give you a break on one thing. We can't do Julia Morgan today. We're going to end in about 3 minutes, but I am going to say that this building is the most famous building by Mabeck, and it is not first Bay tradition. So when I show it to you, I'll go ahead and just give you the minimal facts. Same architect, Maybeck. Palace of Fine Arts. I hope you all know this. It is one of the most beautiful sites in any big city. And it's left over from a World's Fair. It was built for the 1915 San Francisco World's Fair. And it's the only building that people loved so much, those who went to that fair. And that was something like 22 million people back in 1915. That's a big event. Anyway, around 20 million people. And so they voted to save this building, and none of the others were voted to be saved. So it was reconstructed in metal and concrete. It was originally plaster because it was meant to be temporary, like all World's Fair buildings, except for the first one we saw at the start of today's lecture. The Crystal Palace was never meant to be temporary. It was always metal and glass. But every other World's Fair, very few structures were meant to be permanent. Of course, the Eiffel Tower was. But most World's Fairs, every building was torn down. But this one survived because people loved it so much. The voters of San Francisco voted not only to save it, but for money back in 1915, that far back, to restore it so it wouldn't collapse. Because obviously, if it was just left plaster, it'd be gone by now. Okay, so we have a Beaux-Arts style building, and I'm going to go ahead and wait and not give you that definition. It's almost for. Well, actually, let me mention what that means. It's a French movement of architecture and a school, an actual school, physical school, where Maybeck had gone. Julia Morgan, we'll talk about her at the start of next week's Monday lecture. And every other architect you ever heard of, except Frank Lloyd Wright, he was taught. Sullivan went there. All these architects went to the main school of design on the planet at the time, was in Paris, called Beaux-Arts, the School of Beaux-Arts. That's French for beautiful. I'll spell it for you if you want to write it, but you don't have to know how to spell that word. It's not B-E-A-U-X and then A-R-T-S. We've got one more building here. Let's try that. Sorry, I want to just wrap it up because it's almost 4:20. So this is survived since 1915 because of how much people love it, and weddings are held here. And you may have heard this sad news, and now there are thugs robbing wedding parties in front of the bride and groom as their photos are being taken and pistol whipping them. Oh God, that's tragic. Yeah, it's been in the news recently. So unfortunately, I'm afraid this place isn't quite as safe as it has been for over a century. Hopefully it will be again soon. Anyway, what we have is a man-made lake. He created that landscaping. Maybeck was not just an architect, he was a landscape designer too. He was a genius. No question he was a genius. And he put this in the setting that makes it so beautiful, even more than otherwise any other World's Fair building. No one else had thought to do that. Because if you've never seen it at night, you see it on the news or look it up on the internet and you'll see it. It has changing colors throughout the night, just like it did during the World's Fair. They had colored lighting in 1915 and it reflects in the water. It's just incredibly beautiful. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I'm not going to do the formal analysis. It's already 4:20. So you can cross it off your list, I guess, even though I hate to do that. But not the next two slides, which we will start with. Julia Morgan, she's really important. So you can take your pen, and that's for the last thing today. Last task for you, but take any more notes is go ahead and cross off Maybeck Palace of Fine Arts, but not the other Maybeck building, not the church. Okay.
I did a naughty photo shoot there one time.
Oh yeah, what was that for again?
I said naughty.
I don't know.
I won't go into detail about that.
Okay. That's interesting. The only person I've ever heard say that. Anyway, so let's do the stop the share and stick around for a few minutes for questions. Anyway, I hope some of these slides in the lecture information is not just stuff that obviously you're going to need to study for the test, but inspires you to go see some of these places. I mean, most people have heard of the Palace of Fine Arts, and I think every movie ever filmed in San Francisco that has locations on location, right, has used that as a backdrop. But for weddings, it's something like, I don't know, hundreds of weddings every month. Or I need to get a haircut. It's what my daughter told me when I left the house this morning. Anyway, the point is that there's been a lot of love of that building. In fact, that site has well over 1 million people a year. It used to be the site for the Exploratorium, a children's, well, not just children, but mostly focused for children's science museum. Now that moved to Pier 39 or something on the waterfront. But it is still an exhibit area that is used by various groups, and sometimes meetings are held there by professional organizations, groups of scientists, engineers, or lawyers even. So it's still used. Now we're talking about the building behind the temple, which Maybeck designed too, as the actual exhibit hall for all the painting and sculpture. That's what is meant when we say the Palace of Fine Arts. What does that mean? Every World's Fair has had one. Every World's Fair. Because some building is designated for where all the paintings from around the world and sculpture are going to play. And that's what that was in the 1915 World's Fair of San Francisco. Okay, any questions from anybody about anything? I think it's pretty clear. You're going to see, let's say by Friday morning anyway, sir, you should be able to see in your inbox your grades and the, explanation of how you got those, a brief explanation for your second midterm. Mostly good grades. Yeah, and a lot of people did better on this midterm than the first if they didn't do an A already on the first midterm. So hopefully that's a good sign. Okay, extra credit options still exist, but we're running down to where what have we got? 4 weeks left, right? And of course, you should take advantage if you think you might need those extra. Yes, please, go ahead.
I have a question. When you were talking about the main features of skyscrapers,
Yep.
you mentioned that the first thing is that it's a building of 10 or more stories. And this isn't obviously probably pertinent to what we're studying, but I just curious if you knew if that includes floors underground, like basement parking floors.
Interesting. No one's ever asked that question. No, it doesn't. That's a good point though, isn't it? Yeah, because there are all kinds of buildings with 2 and 3 or even 4 levels below ground. No, it's above ground. Yeah, that's the AIA.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. It makes sense though to consider that as a possible feature of a skyscraper, but no, they mean above floor. So then you'd have
Okay, makes sense.
yeah, you'd have those floors added to the 10 and whatever that total is would be that. But really the structure above ground is considered the actual building. The rest is just infrastructure, right? Okay, let's go. Let's go ahead on. Let's get you going. I mean, you guys have things to do. Thank you all for your attention, and don't forget to keep those notes handy and study them carefully. And then Monday will still, the same thing will apply, that at least 1, if not 2 of those slides that I will show of Julia Morgan, definitely at least one of her buildings. Well, I can't say for sure, will probably be on the final. So you want to attend that, and of course, keep those notes and study, as well as watch the review of it recorded, of course, posted on YouTube by, well, this lecture will be by Friday evening, and the one for next week, of course, a week later. All right, see you guys. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.